Hello, and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into the regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I'm Ali Itani, filling in for Katie Jensen. On this episode, we sit down with British Conservative MP, former minister, and businessman of Arab origins, Nadhim Zahawi. We ask him about his time in politics, his take on the current Labour government, and what is next for him in his business career. We also talk to him about The Boy from Baghdad, his recently released biography, documenting his fascinating rise from an 11-year-old Iraqi refugee to one of the most prominent Tory politicians today. Mr. Zahawi, thank you for joining us. Allow me to start with your book, The Boy from Baghdad, which has had some mixed reviews in the British press. While to many in your home country of Iraq, you're seen as a successful role model, in the UK there seems to be some cynics, particularly as you are seen privileged and unauthentic. Frankly speaking, does this signify that refugees can only be portrayed and accepted as a burden?
I mean, a great question in many ways. And sometimes I worry of the polarization of society. Now, luckily, some of it is probably driven by social media. And social media, as I'm very fond of telling my colleagues in Parliament, is not the real world. I remember when I was running the Cabinet Office and Her late Majesty passed away. That first night, I went up, we've got a giant media room in the Cabinet Office, 70 Whitehall. And if you believe Twitter, you think that half the country was Republican, anti the monarchy. The next day, His Majesty then delivered his first address as king to the nation, 98% approval rating. And so you'll forgive me if I say to you that I sometimes don't worry too much about the criticism or those who throw brickbats. It goes with the territory in many ways. And I address it in the book. I talk about my sort of imposter feeling that just because I came from a privileged family background in Iraq, landing in the United Kingdom in 1978-79, but not having the same financial struggles as, say, a refugee today that would land in the United Kingdom. We had different financial struggles much later on, which I address in the book, and pretty dire ones, including the bank taking away our home. But because of success, and maybe because I don't conform to the stereotype of what brown people should do in politics in the UK, that they should be socialists or they should be left-wing, Labour.
Reading your biography, I must say that unlike the assumptions, you clearly didn't have it easy. Apart from your family losing its wealth, you suffered racism and were called a Paki growing up. Would you say Britain has always had a racism problem?
I mean, in the 80s, it was very different to today, including my own party. I think the Conservative Party of the 80s was a bit of a closed shop for people of my background, but I persevered. And I think, look, there is always going to be elements of racism. I think if you look at the evidence, the UK has dealt with it in a much better way than pretty much every other country around us in Europe. We used to have, when I was growing up, the National Front, which then sort of morphed into the BNP, the British National Party. But they never really cut through in British politics. So they were always very low level, 1 or 2 percentage points. Never really became a mainstream party, the way you're seeing in France and in Germany and elsewhere. And so I think we must be doing something right. And I'm very proud, which I think is a really interesting piece of evidence. My constituency of Stratford-on-Avon is 97% white, affluent, middle class, farming community, big agriculture. It's not just, obviously, it's famous for William Shakespeare, but it's a big rural constituency. They voted Nadhim Zahawi, boy born in Baghdad. Every election, I increased my majority. So I think in many ways, I think Britain is a great example of integration, but there are elements, and we saw it recently with the riots, and I wrote about this recently, it did worry me that the fabric of society is being pulled apart. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Well, Mr. Zahawi, as we look around the world, we see a growing sentiment of xenophobia and hatred towards others. Unfortunately, this has recently exploded in the UK, just as the new Labour government took office. Who or what do you blame for the rise of increasing racism in your country?
So I think two things are happening at the same time, and we have to address both. So we have to address the racist head on, and I think it's important that we send a very clear message that taking things into your own hand and going out and antagonizing, bullying, beating people just because of their background or color is completely unacceptable. And we have to deliver that message very, very clearly. And I think it's incumbent on the leadership, the Prime Minister down, to do that. But there's another side to this as well, which is in many ways equally important. And that's about integration and making sure that those who choose to make their home in the United Kingdom understand what the UK is all about. What are our values? Shared values, by the way. These things are not unique to a particular color of human being. The values of freedom, opportunity, rule of law, tolerance, really important values. But where I think it goes wrong in the UK, and I think this is relevant also to the Middle East, is we are the most tolerant society, I think, one of the most in the world. But we need to be intolerant of people who preach intolerance. What do I mean by that? There are, thankfully, small minority of people who have hijacked the religion, the wonderful religion of Islam, and are using it as an aggressive political tool. Those people, I think, should be called out. And we do the right thing to call them out. And again, the reason I link it to the region, you look at countries like the UAE, where they've taken this very seriously. And I was one, throughout my career in politics, advocating for the proscription of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. Why? Because you need to tilt against that wind. You need to tilt against that malign influence on society. And if you're an imam in a small mosque in Leicester or Birmingham or Bradford, wherever else, and a couple of thugs come in and say, look, we've taken a house around the corner. Any young men or women who are a bit passionate, send them around and we'll look after them and we'll teach them. At the moment, that imam is on his own. And you know what human interaction and bullying can do. Now, if we prescribe, at least you give that imam the reason to say, I'm really sorry, I can't do that because it's illegal in this country. And I think we also need to address that issue. So you have to address racism, but you have to also address the malign influence of some of these minority groups in society, because otherwise you will lose the goodwill of the British people. What really poisons the well of goodwill is the unfairness, for example, of the small boat crossings. Not only are they putting those people's lives in danger, right, and these gangs are profiteering from it, but the average Brit, including immigrant stock, my family, would look at that and say, that's not fair, right? Why do they get to jump the queue when I've had to go through a process? Now, at the same time, we have to have safe and legal routes for genuine asylum seekers, people who are fleeing a Saddam Hussein, as my family did, like we did with the Afghan refugees, with the Ukrainians, with the Hong Kong refugees. So you need all these things to work together. But what it really needs is clarity of leadership. And I think it's incumbent on Keir Starmer, and I hope he will look very seriously at prescribing the Brotherhood.
Ironically, many in this current government have blamed what they inherited from you and your conservative colleagues for what they call an anti-immigration policy. I want to ask you, how could you, the boy from Baghdad, but also sitting on the same bench of a party that wanted to send refugees to Rwanda?
So let me just unpack some of that. Currently today, the net migration number, which is the people who are leaving the UK to the people coming into the UK, so the net increase in migration into the United Kingdom is about 740,000 people last year, right? Clearly, our public services cannot cope with a city the size of Bath being built every year to be able to accommodate that level of migration. Successive government, including my own, and you're absolutely right to say, look, do you take responsibility for this? You guys have been in power for 14 years. We've been promising, Prime Minister after Prime Minister, that we would bring down migration numbers. Cameron said it would be tens of thousands. It has gone on one trajectory, and that's up. And that has to be our priority, this government's priority. But I say ours because I think we should try and take the politics out of this. And it's good to see some of the candidates who are putting themselves forward to lead the Conservative Party talking about having a parliamentary debate and agreeing a quota of how many immigrants do we need in the UK? What does the UK economy need, whether it's in healthcare or other parts of the economy, and what can we home grow as well? Now, that 740,000 is the real issue here. 40,000 are coming in illegally on these small boats. Now, the problem with that is, although it is the smaller number, less significant, some people say, well, it's not that big. Anyway, I think it is that and the unfairness of that, the perception that this is really bad, it's unfair. Why should these people get to jump the queue to come into the United Kingdom, that poisons the well of goodwill with the British public? And so Rwanda, by the way, in my view, was a good deterrent. If you look at what actually happened when we had the vote at midnight, when we were in government, literally the next week after the vote, within hours, within days, illegal migrants were crossing back through Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland because there's an open border, because they thought, gosh, I'm going to get deported to Rwanda. Other European countries now are looking at offshore processing. So I think these things, we almost need to sort of take some of the emotion out of this and say, what do we need to do here? Because this, I will say to you here, will probably be the challenge of the next decade for Western democracies, European democracies. It brought down the Dutch government a few months ago. I think it'll bring down other governments. Just take one piece of evidence. Libya and anything south of Libya, there's about 500 million people, who will come under pressure and are capable of movement for political reasons, for environmental reasons, or economic. Clearly, Europe cannot absorb 500 million people. So we have to have some really serious work done upstream in those countries to stabilize them, to allow them to become prosperous. The UAE is doing a lot of that work. We should look at what they're doing and see if we can partner with them. Because the work they're doing in Africa is second only to China and the investment China is making in Africa. We need to choose our partners. Why do I say that? Because you've got to tackle the problem upstream, because you're never going to cope with it if it keeps going in the direction it's going in at the moment in your own countries in Europe.
Writing in the London Times last August, you described the UK as still the most tolerant country on earth. Many might disagree and say recent events have proven otherwise. And not only that, but that it has become unsafe too, with many taking the law to their own hands. How do you respond?
Well, one, I think it needs a very clear leadership and strategy from the Home Secretary, from the Prime Minister. And they would have my support in actually being very, very clear with anyone who is rule-breaking, law-breaking, that is unacceptable in our country. And that needs to go for, as I say, both sides, the racists, as well as those who I think are hijacking the religion of Islam in malign intentions, in my view. But that clarity, we should not be shy about talking. For example, whilst I served in Parliament, we had all these grooming gangs scandals that eventually became so high profile that people had to sit up and take notice, where the police were clearly far too reticent, shy from investigating somebody just because of their background. They happen to be Pakistani men who were grooming these teenagers, these children, into sex slavery. We should not, as a government, shy away from calling out bad behavior from communities just because they happen to be brown or whatever color or creed. And I think those two things have to go hand in hand. And I'm confident, genuinely confident, I think we can do this. And I wrote about this in the Times, as you say, that in my view, the United Kingdom, as I always say, is the most tolerant society in the world. To take a boy from Baghdad and make him second Lord of the Treasury, to live in number 11 Downing Street, I can't think of many countries around the world who would do that. But it is incumbent upon us to lead on this topic.
Well, a recent tweet by you addressed to the Mayor of London with a photo of a man sleeping rough in Mayfair stirred up quite a storm. Do you view the controversy as proof of a more moral and increasingly progressive California-like society, or a sign of political correctness that tolerates no debate on homelessness and immigration?
The way I look at this is I walk all over London, all right? Genuinely, I do about 20,000 steps a day. And I could have taken that picture in Victoria Street, many parts of London. Sadly, we've got a real problem with homelessness at the moment. I just happened to be walking through Hertford Street, and I saw this poor, tragic human being lying on the pavement in the morning. And I wanted to highlight that this really is an issue, and it's heartbreaking. I think I put on there, it's heartbreaking in the imagery. But the response, now, the sensible people, like the local councillor, came back to me and said, look, where was this exactly? The reason I put Mayfair is just to identify where it was, so that maybe help can, because I'm high profile, someone might read the tweet, then they'll offer help to this unfortunate soul. But then you've got the sort of the Twitter pylon from the lefties who then attack your success and your wealth as if I'm somehow affronted by this just because it happens to be Mayfair. No, right? Part of the problem we've got in London now, and it is tragic. You look at Park Lane. There's a whole tent encampment right in the middle of the island. Go to Victoria Street. Go to other postcodes around London. You see the same thing, and that cannot be right. The perception around the world, in the UAE, of their citizens going to England and getting mugged or hurt by some of these criminal gangs, at the moment is reaching a level that I think is deeply damaging to the image of the United Kingdom and to London. And it's only right to call it out and say to the mayor, come on, do something about this. Like we came together on vaccine, we put our politics aside and we said, let's protect the nation. Well, let's protect the nation again.
The first thing the new British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said upon taking office was, country first, party second. Given that among the first things he has done was to move the portrait of Margaret Thatcher, do you believe him?
I felt very sad at watching him get himself completely out of sorts and couldn't quite explain why he removed the portrait of the late Margaret Thatcher to Laura Kuenssberg on the BBC. He got himself tied up in knots on it. And I just think this sort of, dare I say, vindictive type behavior, because he then tried to claim that he doesn't like portraits of people staring down, and then people started tweeting out lots of other portraits in the building that he has to sit and work beneath. And I thought it's petty, honestly. I mean, he talks about country first and party second. The one thing I would have expected from a Labour Prime Minister and a Labour Chancellor is to put more pressure on the union paymasters and say, hold on a second, inflation is back down to the 2%. We need to keep it there because inflation is deeply damaging, especially to most vulnerable families in the country. Instead, what do? They absolutely bend over backwards and give these union paymasters the massive pay settlements, which will put more pressure on the Bank of England not to lower interest rates because wage inflation, is then driven by that decision. And so I worry about when someone says, I'm putting country first. Let's look at one other thing. I think we talked about it earlier. If you really worry about the United Kingdom, you want to see growth in the economy, because that's the only way you can pay for public services, right? So either through growing the economy, right, cutting the cost of public services and therefore public services themselves, or taxation. And since we're at the highest tax burden in 70 years already, and we take responsibility for that. My government was absolutely mistaken, in my view, to have taxes at such a high level. But we had to pay for the 408 billion safety net that we spent on the COVID response to protect jobs and businesses. But we take our responsibility for it. But if you really care about the British economy, why are you exporting talent? Second only to China and losing millionaires. Now, I know wealth is not the only proxy, as I said, to talent, but it's a pretty good proxy. And we're only second to China of losing people to Abu Dhabi and Dubai and elsewhere around the world. And we're importing low-skilled labor. And within that, some of the issues that you and I discussed earlier about political Islam and the Brotherhood and so on.
The Guardian has recently criticized you for not condemning the 2003 Iraq War. Just to be clear, you were not part of the Labour government which waged it. I want to clarify, did you mean you supported the toppling of Saddam regime, but not the way it was conducted, or did you support both?
No, I think that's right. So I tell you, what Saddam did to the Kurds and the Shia community in the south was abominable. It was murderous. It was criminal. You know, the Enfal program alone is responsible for 182,000 innocent souls being murdered, 4,000 Kurdish villages burnt to the ground. And so I think it's only right that the world helped these unfortunate souls, these communities, depose such an evil tyrant. Post-war, I think actually we really made a terrible error of judgment. And I would very easily explain to those interested that I think Tony Blair should have been much more robust to our most important ally, the United States of America, by saying, look, let's show me the plan, right? Of course we can defeat this tyrant, but what happens the next day? Disbanding the Iraqi army, sending home anyone who belonged to the Ba'ath Party, de-Ba'athification program that Paul Bremer was responsible for, I think was criminal. You send home 700,000 men, right, with no hope of a job, right, no way to put food on the table, and a gun in their pocket. What do you think is going to happen? The end is ISIS, right? That was a terrible, terrible decision. And I think it's right to be able to almost disaggregate those two things and say, actually, the removal of an evil dictator was right, but we never really planned for the day after properly. And we have to take part of that responsibility in the United Kingdom.
One last question. There are many reports that you're buying the Daily Telegraph, a right-wing British newspaper that a UAE company was banned from taking over. Where are we on those discussions?
So there's a process taking place. Redbird IMI are selling, and they've just actually sold the Spectator for I think a fantastic price, an incredible price in many ways for what is a wonderful magazine, to be fair, the world's oldest magazine, The Spectator, but to get £100 million for that, I have to say, credit to IMI and Redbird. Clearly, they knew what they were doing when they were buying these assets. You'll forgive me, I won't comment on a live commercial process. Suffice to say that it would be an honor and a privilege to lead a great newspaper like the Daily Telegraph, and it is one of our great products. And actually, their online presence is one of the best in the industry, and well done to the team that delivers that.
Mr. Zahawi, looking at some of the headlines around this topic, I see The Independent and The Guardian referring to your takeover bid as a plot. Why is there such hostility towards the topic? The Independent itself was sold to a Russian owner, and the UK ought to be open for business, particularly when a patriot such as yourself is involved.
I agree with you. And I have to say, I think the way this whole episode was handled, or mishandled, I should say, I think if Margaret Thatcher would have her say, the UK should always be open for business. The way you protect particular sectors of the economy, if they required protection, whether it's nuclear or media, is through regulation, good regulation, not legislation. I think that is a terrible error of judgment, especially when we want more investment and when the great corporates of the UAE, like Mubadala, like IMI with their joint venture with Redbird, the US fund, want to come and invest in the United Kingdom. I think it's an error of judgment not to have looked at that and then allowed regulation to protect editorial independence. I disagree with some of my colleagues who push back on that.
Mr. Zahawi, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.